Keeping it real, keeping it real. Keeping it real, keeping it real. Keeping it real with Reverend Laura.
This idea of loving thy neighbor. Loving thy neighbor. This idea of being in community with others in a way in which we can just absolutely generate that positive feeling of love for them. So most often this passage about love thy neighbor as thyself comes from the book of Matthew. That's where it's most often quoted. I actually like the way it's written in Mark better. So Jesus is meeting with a bunch of people, and it actually is the Pharisees, and they're trying to trick him. They're trying to see if they can catch him not knowing the answers to questions that they ask. And so they ask him a whole series of one. And then one of the Pharisees asked this question, what's the most important commandment? This happened to be a Pharisee who was very learned in the law according to Moses, the 10 Commandments. And of course, Jesus just kind of blows them all away by ignoring those and going on and saying, he says, "Hear this, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind and with all your strength." And the second most important commandment, love thy neighbor as yourself. There are no other commandments greater than these. Then he goes on to say, to love your neighbor as yourself is more important than all of the burnt offerings and sacrifices we could ever make. To love your neighbor as yourself is more important than any kind of sacrifice, any kind of offering, anything else we could ever do. Our founder, Ernest Holmes, has a whole section in the Science of Mind textbook about teachings from the New Testament. And he says this, the two great commandments are to love God and all other beings. On these hang the law and of the prophets. Love is the complete unity with life. And we cannot enter this state unless we are in unity with all that lives, for all is one. To love God alone is not enough, for this would exclude your fellow beings. And to love humankind alone is not sufficient, for this would be a too limited concept of God. Love thy neighbor. So who is our neighbor? Who is our neighbor? To understand the answer to that question, we have to get to a clear understanding of what our own spiritual identity is. Who we are, in order to understand who our neighbor is. In his book, Practicing the Presence, Joel Goldsmith has an entire chapter entitled Love Thy Neighbor. And in there he talks about this idea of spiritual identity. This idea of spiritual identity is so all-encompassing. We limit ourselves when we think that God is a certain thing. And we limit ourselves when we think we are a certain thing. And we limit ourselves when we think rocks are a certain thing. When we miss the point that we're all interconnected, we are limiting ourselves in lots of different ways. Joel says, when we say, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, we are not speaking of human love, affection, or friendliness, but we are holding our neighbor in high spiritual identity. And then we see the effect of this right identification in the human picture. When we see our neighbor as that which is in and of God, then we are loving our neighbor. Whether our neighbor appears to be a friend, a relative, an enemy, a flower, a plant, or a stone.
Keeping it real with Reverend Laura.